London has a particular kind of silence before a rupture an hour when the city looks calm, but the institutions beneath it are already awake, already moving. Paperwork is being stamped. Phones are being held too tightly. Doors that should remain closed are being tested. And somewhere in that machinery, a single legal action can do what no scandal ever fully achieves. It can force a monarchy to confront its past in plain daylight. In the early hours of a December morning, a claim began circulating through the royal press ecosystem, whispered first as court activity, then hardened into something more ominous, that sensitive divorce-era material connected to Diana. Princess of Wales was about to become accessible again. No palace aide wants to be the person caught unprepared when old documents become new ammunition. And no modern royal household, already operating under relentless scrutiny, can afford a second narrative storm built on the bones of the first. Here is what can be stated with certainty. Anchored to the historical record, Diana's divorce was finalized in 1996. And contemporary reporting described the settlement as substantial, with a lump sum widely reported in the tens of millions and an ongoing annual amount to support her office. Those same reports also described efforts to control what could be said publicly, because in the monarchy, reputation isn't a byproduct of power. It is the power. This is the uncomfortable truth many forget. The Diana era was not only a family tragedy. It was also an information war fought in tabloids, in carefully phrased statements and selective leaks, and in the gaps between what the public could prove and what it desperately wanted to believe, and the press, much of it, was not an innocent observer. Years later, the BBC's own crisis around Martin Bashir's 1995 Panorama interview would expose how deception, manipulation, and institutional self-protection shaped the environment around Diana's public life. The Guardian reported the BBC paid damages and apologized to Diana's former private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, after the Dyson report found Bashir used forged documents, and the BBC fell short of standards in how it handled the matter. That history matters now, because it explains why any new release of Diana-era material, real, rumored, or partial, would trigger immediate public suspicion about who controlled the narrative then, and who is trying to control it now. So when the rumor of documents resurfacing began to spread, it didn't land on neutral ground. It landed on a battlefield that has never truly been cleared. By the time daylight reached Kensington Palace, the situation, at least inside the royal machine, would have been treated like a containment event. Not because anyone believed diamonds would shatter or flags would fall, but because they understand the modern reality. One headline is a spark. One screenshot is a wildfire. One misread line becomes an entire ideology. And this is where Prince William enters the story, not as a tabloid character, but as a strategic actor trapped in a uniquely painful position, because William is not just the heir. He is Diana's son. He carries the responsibility of protecting the institution, and he carries a responsibility that is older than the crown itself. Protecting the truth of his mother from being turned into someone else's weapon. What the public often forgets is that Diana's divorce and everything surrounding it was built on a hard bargain. Contemporary US and UK reporting described negotiations over money, title, residence, office support, and restrictions around disclosure. The Washington Post wrote in July 1996 that while monetary details were officially kept confidential, British press reporting described a major lump sum and a yearly amount for Diana's office, and noted discussion around a clause forbidding Diana from talking about the financial settlement, with reports that she wanted Charles similarly gagged. This is not trivia. It is the architecture of the crisis, because if you understand that this divorce was structured with confidentiality and reputational safeguards at its core, then you understand why any later surge of paperwork, any hint of letters, notes, side agreements would be treated as existential to palace stability. Not because it changes what happened, but because it changes what the public believes happened. And belief is the terrain on which monarchies live or die. In the story now circulating, the emotional center is not a judge's signature or a courthouse timestamp. The emotional center is a screen in a private study, the glow of scanned pages, and the shock of recognizing a familiar handwriting in an unfamiliar setting. A mother's handwriting does that. It moves through time with a force that law and media cannot replicate. Even in verified history, Diana's story is filled with that tension. She was simultaneously constrained by the institution and powerful in the way she shaped public sympathy. She was neither powerless hostage nor unrestrained insurgent. She was a political force trapped in a royal system designed to absorb political forces. That is why any narrative that reduces her to one thing, saint, victim, rebel, pawn, always ends up being propaganda. And propaganda is exactly what William would be anticipating. Because he has seen it before, seeing his mother's memory recruited for battles she never consented to fight across the Atlantic. This pressure intensifies. American media has historically treated Diana as a moral drama with clear villains and clean heroes. But British audiences living closer to the monarchy's cultural gravity have often consumed Diana as a contradiction. Adored, wounded, strategic, brilliant, and sometimes reckless. These differences matter because in the first hours of any breaking story, audiences don't absorb information. They absorb frames. The framing becomes the outcome, and that's when the most dangerous variable enters. Prince Harry. Harry's public break with royal life has, for years, been interpreted through the story of Diana, her suffering, her public battles, and her death. If new Diana-era material appears, Harry is positioned by the press, by supporters, by critics as the one most likely to treat it as validation, which places William in a brutal, almost impossible role. The brother who must intervene before the narrative ossifies, but the brother whose intervention can be spun as institutional discipline rather than familial truth. This is why, in the reconstruction now circulating, there is a phone call, not a palace statement, not a briefing, not a press conference, a call private, human, direct, made because the public battlefield is too contaminated for clean messaging to survive. And if you understand high stakes, crisis environments, war rooms, hostage negotiations, diplomatic emergencies, you understand the instinct. When the perimeter is collapsing, you don't broadcast into the noise. You communicate to the one person whose next move could decide the shape of the conflict. So, William calls Harry, whether every detail of this dramatized timeline is literal fact or narrative reconstruction. The strategic logic is unmistakable. If Harry speaks first, the story becomes a weapon. If William reaches him first, the story might remain what it should have been from the beginning, a record of a mother navigating an unforgiving system to protect her sons inside the palace ecosystem. There is one more figure who understands this instinct better than almost anyone. Princess Anne. She has spent decades surviving storms without feeding them. She knows that sometimes the most decisive act is not a public gesture, but a private intervention. In this moment, the monarchy's condition in late 2025 adds further pressure. King Charles has been increasingly open by royal standards about his health journey. In a message released by the royal family in December 2025, Charles said his schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced in the new year and that ongoing measures would move into a precautionary phase. The palace has also emphasized the importance of early screening, using the king's experience to encourage public action. That context matters, because institutions under strain become more sensitive to narrative shocks. A palace managing health uncertainty cannot afford a second crisis built on grief, memory, and accusations, especially when the fault lines between the brothers remain a global spectacle. So the question is no longer, what do the documents say? The question becomes, who gets to define what the documents mean? Because meaning is where politics lives. And now, as the day accelerates, headlines rewriting themselves, talking heads filling airtime, social media turning fragments into verdicts, the palace faces the oldest dilemma in modern monarchy: speak and look defensive, or stay silent and let others write the story. The moment a sensitive archive surfaces, real, partial, leaked, or merely rumored, the palace doesn't react like a celebrity brand. It reacts like a state system under threat. Because this isn't a family protecting feelings. This is an institution protecting continuity, and continuity is a national asset. The Crown doesn't wear camouflage, but it still thinks in terms of perimeter, exposure, and containment, and that is why the first response is almost never a loud statement. The first response is a quiet room, private secretaries, legal advisors, communications staff, and the kind of disciplined silence you see in crisis units, people trained to do the one thing modern media punishes most: wait, because time matters. In the first hour of a narrative shock, facts don't become truth. Frames become truth. A headline becomes a verdict. A clip becomes a lifetime. A single phrase, hush money, gag order, cover up can cement itself into public imagination long before any document is read with adult seriousness. That's why, in our reconstruction of how a palace would move, the most important asset isn't a press officer. It's the sequence. Who speaks first? What gets said first? What gets ignored first? What gets denied first? And Prince William, in a situation like this, becomes both sword and shield because he is one of the only people alive who can speak about Diana with moral authority, while also carrying the weight of the institution she struggled against. But before we go further, there is a line we have to draw sharp. Clean and honest. I cannot find credible mainstream reporting that a UK court has unsealed new Diana divorce files on a specific December morning in 2025 in the way rumor accounts describe. The verified record does show that Diana's divorce negotiations were intensely legalistic and heavily managed, with financial terms widely reported and reputational safeguards central to the settlement. That distinction matters because, in modern information warfare, the appearance of a sealed truth suddenly released can be just as destabilizing as the release itself. A leak does not have to be complete to be operational. It only has to be emotionally convincing. And Diana, more than almost any figure in modern royal history, still carries the emotional voltage to light up an entire news cycle. So what would a palace strategist do? First, they would anticipate the obvious framing, because the divorce was always going to be recast as a morality play. But the historical record, even as reported at the time, was more complicated than the simplified internet versions. The Washington Post reported in July 1996 that no monetary details were officially released. But British press reports described Diana receiving a lump sum in the range of $22.27 million and roughly $600,000 per year to run her office, while losing the HRH style and keeping her Kensington Palace residence with shared custody arrangements. In other words, the settlement was substantial, but it came with symbolic loss, and the symbolism is the point. In monarchies, titles and styles aren't etiquette. They're constitutional branding. Second, they would remember what happened the last time. Diana's story became an institutional firestorm because the palace has not forgotten the BBC Panorama scandal. In 2021, an investigation led by former Judge John Dyson concluded that BBC journalist Martin Bashir used deceit, most notoriously forged bank statements, to secure the 1995 interview, and that BBC leadership mishandled the fallout and investigation. Prince William's response was not subtle. He condemned the deception and argued that it had consequences for his mother's life and for public trust. Sky News summarized William's statement with the line that still hangs over British media like a warning flare. William said BBC failures contributed significantly to his mother's fear and paranoia, language that reframed the interview not as journalism, but as exploitation. Then came the institutional reckoning. The BBC issued apologies and paid damages to figures harmed by the deception. The Guardian reported in 2022 that the BBC paid substantial damages and apologized to Diana's former private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, over harm caused by Bashir's false claims. Those are verified facts, and they explain something essential about the present. If a new wave of Diana-related documents appears, whether via court process, leak, or political maneuver, William does not see it as harmless curiosity. He sees it as a battlefield where his mother's life and public memory have already been weaponized once by one of the most powerful broadcasters on earth. So a palace war room would operate under a brutal rule. Don't repeat the BBC mistake in reverse, meaning do not overreact in a way that feeds the story. Do not deny in a way that looks like guilt. Do not offer emotional commentary that becomes a soundbite. Let documents, if real, speak while ensuring that the two people most likely to turn them into a permanent family fracture do not become enemies in public. Again, and that brings us to the private call, because private calls are how institutions attempt to prevent public detonations. If you're looking at this through a geopolitical lens, the call is not sentiment. It is deconfliction. The same logic that keeps militaries from stumbling into accidental war. The same logic that makes rivals maintain quiet back channels when the official channels are polluted with politics. William's calculation in that moment would be brutally clear if Harry Reid's new material, real or alleged through the prism of his own history with the monarchy. The next public move could be irreversible. A statement, a documentary, a lawsuit, a speech, something that locks positions into place and turns grief into doctrine, and once doctrine forms, it doesn't dissolve. It hardens. This is why Catherine's role in this type of moment is strategically important, even when she says almost nothing. She is one of the few people close enough to William to speak without triggering his defensive instincts, and stable enough to encourage a move that is emotionally costly but operationally necessary. It's also why Anne's role matters. Anne is not just family. She is an institutional veteran. Her presence in the monarchy's continuity structure is literal as well as symbolic. She was added by Parliament to the pool of councillors of state in 2022, reinforcing her role as a stabilizing asset in moments of strain. And strain is the backdrop of late 2025. The palace has been dealing with intense public attention on health and continuity for months. On December 12, 2025, the royal family's official site published the King's message for Stand Up to Cancer, where Charles said early diagnosis and effective intervention meant his schedule of cancer treatment could be reduced in the new year, with ongoing measures moving into what Buckingham Palace described as a precautionary phase. That context doesn't cause a Diana story, but it changes the palace's tolerance for chaos. When an institution is already managing one sensitive narrative, a second sensitive narrative becomes a compounding risk, and here is the part the public rarely sees. Palace silence isn't just privacy. It's a tactic designed to reduce oxygen. But in the platform age, oxygen doesn't come from press releases, it comes from engagement, from outrage, from emotional certainty. So instead of issuing a long defense, a palace would likely do something colder and more strategic. It would allow a minimal acknowledgement, if any, and then it would shift to stability imagery, duty, calm appearances, controlled messaging while privately trying to prevent Harry and William from becoming opposing commanders in a new war over Diana's meaning. That is why the phone call again, not as romantic reconciliation but as crisis containment, becomes so plausible as an institutional move, because if the brothers can reach even a narrow agreement on one point, that Diana's story is not a blunt instrument, then the most dangerous outcome can be avoided. A public split where each side claims Diana as proof of its righteousness, turning a mother into a banner, and banners are what armies march under.